David Yakir here, and thanks for listening. So I've been thinking about a conversation we had at dinner the other night. We were talking about the extraordinary dessert that Bill had made for us, and one of our guests mentioned that as she got older, she started binging on sweets, especially after dinner. What was funny is that so many of the guests agreed, which led me to inviting psychologist Dr. Glenn Livingston, whose Never Binge Again is the therapy of choice for so many. So that's what we'll yak about today. What's up, everybody? David Yakir here for Yak About Today, hoping you are better, healthier, and more informed than any generation that came before. So if the years 46 to 64 mean something to you, then this is the place you want to be. Now put your headphones on, go for a run, and listen to what we yak about today. And we are back. I'm David Yakir. You're listening to Yak About Today. And as promised, I've got Dr. Glenn Livingston here with me. And I really appreciate you coming on the air with me.
I really appreciate you having me here, David. And please call me Glenn.
Okay, Glenn. All right. Doc Glenn or Doc. Or
whatever
anyway.
you want.
All right. Anyway, we're going to talk a lot about binge eating, which is a specialty of yours. And what I'm really curious about, and I often do this most of the time I do this on our show, is we have an audience, 55 plus generally, and we gear the discussion to that market. So if you would, give us your background and maybe a story that led you into this particular topic.
Well, I'm 54 years old, and I'm not just a psychologist, but I'm a former binge eater with a very serious problem. I come from a family of psychologists. 17 people are therapists in my family, and the standard joke is that if something breaks in the house, we all know how to ask it how it feels, and nobody knows how to fix it. But I've always wanted to be a psychologist first and foremost, and because I got married young, didn't have kids, and didn't commute, I had the opportunity to do a lot of consulting for industry, including big food. So I learned a lot about what was going on in the behind the scenes in the big food world. And because I had a serious problem with eating myself, I'm 6'4", I'm reasonably muscular, and I discovered early on that if I worked out for 2 or 3 hours a day, I could eat whatever I wanted to. Because I had a serious problem with eating myself when I got older, and I couldn't work out like that, and my triglycerides went through the roof, and the doctors were telling me I was going to die when I was 30, and I was thinking about food while I was seeing patients, and I was just really, really upset about it all. I did everything you could possibly imagine to solve the problem. Of course, I saw all the best psychologists, but I also went to Overeaters Anonymous. I took medication. I read all the books, and some things worked to varying degrees, and then it seemed to get worse. And I would just be sitting with suicidal patients and not be 100% present, which really scared me. I would be thinking about when can I get that next whole pizza or go to the delicatessen and just eat everything in the tray. And long story short, I wound up doing a study for myself because these companies were paying me a lot of money to do these big studies. I knew how to do them. So I created a study trying to figure it all out. And I got 40,000 people over the course of about 5 years to take a survey on the internet where they were telling me the foods that they struggled with and the different aspects of their life that troubled them. And I saw a couple of interesting patterns. One of them was that people who struggled with chocolate like I did tended to be lonely or brokenhearted. People who struggled with salty, crunchy things tended to be stressed at work, and people who struggled with soft, chewy things tended to be more stressed at home. And I thought this was probably going to be a miracle, that you could figure out what people binged on, and then you could figure out how to solve those problems. So I started with myself, and I went to talk to my mom, who's also a therapist, and I said, Mom, I'm not in a great marriage, and of course I'm unhappy, but what is it about my upbringing that would let me run to chocolate when I feel lonely or brokenhearted? And Mom gets this horrible look on her face, And she goes, honey, I'm so sorry. And I said, what is it? And she says, well, when you were 1 year old, your dad was a captain in the army, and they were talking about sending him to Vietnam, and I was just terrified. And around the same time, my father, your grandfather, had just gotten out of prison. And I was so depressed. I'd found out when I was pregnant with you. I was so depressed because I'd always idolized him, and I didn't know he was doing these things, and he was guilty. And so I just didn't have the wherewithal to hug you and hold you and love you and feed you when you came running to me as a toddler. And what I did was I got a little refrigerator and I put it on the floor, and I filled it with Bosco chocolate syrup, a big bottle of Bosco chocolate syrup.
I remember that.
Well, so you and I were about the same age. Are you in New York by any chance?
No, I'm not actually down in Florida, but I'm a Brooklyn boy.
Yeah, okay.
Brooklyn, New York.
I'm a Brooklyn boy too. So, well, I worked in Brooklyn anyway. So Bosco chocolate syrup was one of the New York brands. And apparently she'd just say, go get your Bosco. And I'd go running over it. And I'd take it out of the refrigerator. And I'd open the bottle and I'd suck on it and go into a chocolate sugar coma. And David, if you and I were in the movies, if this were a movie, then what would happen at this point is Mom and I would have a big hug and a big cry. And we'd forgive each other. And then I'd never have trouble with chocolate again. But would you believe me if I told you that the problem actually got worse as a result of that conversation? And the reason it got worse was because I discovered this little voice in my head that said something like, hey, Glenn, you know what? You're right. Your mama didn't love you enough. And she left a great big chocolate-sized hole in your heart. And until you can find the love of your life, you're just going to have to go right on binging. Yippee, let's go get some. And what I discovered from that was the beginning of the cure for me, was that sometimes it doesn't matter what the match was that struck the fire. Because once these foods take hold, they have a life of their own. And it's more important to be a fireman than an arson detective or a psychologist. You knowing why doesn't necessarily fix it. It makes you feel better about a lot of things, but it doesn't fix it. What fixes it is figuring out the voice of justification. Like, how are you rationalizing continuing to break your best laid plans? Understanding the strength of a lot of the industrial foods that are out there. I mean, there were no chocolate bars in the savannah. There was no concentration of sugar and oil and fat and excitotoxins and all the things that are engineered into a chocolate bar. Not to say that all chocolate is bad or that people have to give up on it. But we didn't have chocolate bars and chips and pasta and bread and Doritos. We didn't have those things on the savannah. And the billions of dollars that are going into engineering these hyper-palatable concentrations of starch and salt and fat and oil are to press your pleasure buttons and get you to forget about your other needs are in many ways unconscionable and necessary to understand what you're up against. And long story short, I discovered thereafter that a better defense, you could think about it like building a better fireplace around the fire rather than putting the fire out itself. A better defense was to identify the illogical reasoning that justified the translation of emotional upset or desire for binging into actual binge eating, and then disempower that voice by either learning to ignore it or logically dispute it. And that was the bulk of my recovery. I actually decided that I had a pig inside me, and I would make a really clear line in the sand, and I would say, like, I will never have chocolate Monday to Friday. And if I thought about chocolate Monday to Friday, I'd say, well, that's pig slop, and I don't eat pig slop, and I don't know the fireman will tell me what to do. And it's really embarrassing for a guy with my credentials and sophistication to have recovered in that way, but it started to give me those extra microseconds at the moment of impulse to remember who I was and how I wanted to be around that particular food. And ever so slowly, I recovered my power, and I made more rules for myself, and I very, very carefully discovered that I could be the kind of person that I wanted to be around food if I took the time to really clearly delineate who that person was, and I listened really carefully to the justifications that my inner pig had for taking me away from it.
So we're going to go to break, but before we go to break, I have a question about something that you said earlier, and that I personally found it fascinating. When you said there were sort of different issues that people had that led them to eating and binging on different things, chocolate, lonely, you weren't loved, salty, stress. I want to talk more about that because that's something I had never, ever heard before. And then we can sort of get on to about 5 questions that I actually have for you. So
yeah.
if we can hold just a second. I'm David Yeck here. You're listening to Yak About Today, and I've got Dr. Glenn Livingston. And we're going to talk a little more about binge eating when we come back. So I'll see you on the other side. I want to take a moment to talk to you about New Vision Eye Center. You know, for the last couple of years, they've been a sponsor of this show, and I couldn't be prouder. I've met so many people that have walked up to me and thanked me for recommending them. I hear all sorts of stories about how they've worked miracles. And as you know, I've been a patient of New Vision Eye Center for years. So when I say go see Dr. Minotti, Reinauer, Tate, and O'Brien, it's because I wouldn't trust my eyes to anyone else. And we're back. I'm David Yeck here. You're listening to Yak About Today, and I've got Dr. Glenn Livingston. So before we took the break, Glenn, I was really fascinated with the early story about there are different, I guess, issues that people have that lead them to binging on different things, and this was based on your study. Is that a scientific study? Is that something that you go to one of the scientific journals and say, look, if you're depressed about this, and you've been eating saltines nonstop, or, you eat spaghetti because you have these issues, and in your case, you were binging on chocolate because there were sort of, insecure love issues. I may not have said that right. Tell me more about that. That really gets me because, I've never had an issue with eating. I was always going to the gym. I was always 175 pounds. And then as I've aged, all of a sudden I find that chocolate's really appealing to me. Sweets are really appealing to me. And it could be because maybe I'm not loved at this point in my life. But, So tell me more about this.
Well, first of all, it was a correlational study, and correlation can't imply causation. So all we really know are that these modest correlations showed up that said that people who binge on chocolate are more likely to feel lonely or brokenhearted. That's the best that we can say. It was an internet survey. It was recruited from a population of people who were searching for something to do with stress. That was the best place I found to get people to take the survey. And so the best I can say is that if you're feeling stressed, it appears that if the stress is coming from work, you're more likely to run towards crunchy, salty things. If the stress is coming from home, you're more likely to run towards soft, chewy things. And if the stress is coming from loneliness, then you're more likely to run towards chocolate. That's the best I can say. It was a survey. It was a very big survey, but it wasn't a double-blind, randomly controlled scientific study. It's a survey. There was inferential analysis. We can't really generalize it beyond the population of people who said that were feeling stressed. So that's a pretty good-sized population, but there are a lot of methodological flaws in the survey in and of itself, and I don't think that I could defend it to a dissertation committee. What I can say is that it provides a clue. And I didn't pursue another round to make it more scientific because at that point I discovered that it didn't really matter anyway. It was just kind of an interesting thing to talk about, which is how I feel about the interplay between emotions and overeating now too. It's interesting to look back and figure out what your early memories were that set up the patterns, and you can learn things about yourself. And Mom and I became much more forgiving. I was much more forgiving about myself. It was psychologically valuable to do, but it wasn't mission critical for solving the overeating problem. And I got much people that are involved with binge eating, it feels like you don't have a life. It feels like there's someone with a gun pointing at your head saying, sit down at the refrigerator and dislodge your jaw and put everything that you can into your mouth. And so I was much more interested in how to help myself with that and how to help other people with that than in the more pop psychology part of, how do these feelings correlate with particular foods that people binge on, even though that is really interesting.
So let's go to the practical side of this. Now, we know we have an amazing obesity problem in this country, and I understand, actually, Mexico has overtaken us as number one in obesity. So obviously, there's an extraordinary amount of people who would need to go through a process. So let's say you have a patient comes to you. What is the starting point? They're sitting there, and is the starting point you asking them about their lives and trying to understand what the underlying cause of their binge eating is? Or do you go right into sort of behavioral modification things? Or
I go right into more behavioral modification things these days. I enjoy having those conversations about the underlying cause. See, it takes 5 to 10 years in my experience to resolve the stress and loneliness and depression associated with the things that are causing people to eat particular items. And I find that I offer this as coaching, by the way, coaching and education rather than treatment, because it's not entirely in concert with the best practices in my profession all the time, although the evidence is starting to mount that this kind of work actually does work for binge eating. So what I'll do with someone when they sit down is I'll say, well, they'll usually tell me they're all over the place and they can't control themselves. And I'll say, well, what's the single worst thing you do with food? If you could fix one thing, if there were one rule, I know that your inner lizard brain, your inner pig says that you can't do that, but if you could, what's the one thing that you would fix? And some people will say something simple like, I would never eat by the TV again, or I'd never eat standing up, or I'd always put my fork down between bites, or I'd only have chocolate at social occasions, or I'd only eat bread at a restaurant. And when they come up with that one thing, I'll take some time to make sure that rule is very clearly fleshed out. And then I'll ask them, well, what would it mean to you if you became that kind of person who only ate bread at a restaurant? How would your life be different in a year if you did that all year long? And we'll really dig into the motivation for that and what that excess bread was actually doing to their life and what it's going to be like if they don't have the bread. And then I work with them to hear that inner pig. Now tell me all the reasons that your inner pig says that you can't, shouldn't, or won't comply with this rule. And in the context of the future that they're looking for, in the context of extreme clarity about what they're trying to accomplish, those voices become crystal clear, and then we can disempower them. So for example, they'll say, the inner pig says, well, you can do it, but you should just start tomorrow. It'll be just as easy to start tomorrow. You won't gain that much weight. And I'll tell them, well, the truth is, according to the principles of neuroplasticity and all the research, that there's no such thing as being exactly as easy or exactly as hard tomorrow. We're always either reinforcing or extinguishing our addictions. If you have this today, you're going to have a harder time quitting tomorrow. And so we'll look very specifically at the rationale they have, and then we'll obliterate that rationale with facts and logic. And suddenly it becomes easier for people to hear it for what it is, which is just the pig squealing for its slop.
I have a question before we're going to lose we have about a minute and a half before we lose our broadcast audience.
Yeah.
What do you think about people turning to surgery instead of therapy in dealing with their binge eating or obesity or, that type of thing? Because, I've encountered, and I'm sort of close to people who underwent, and I'm not sure what it is, where they reduce the size of the stomach or they strap something. And I'm not, I'm pretty naive about those things. I just know they've gone. Tell me what your feeling is. And again, we have about a minute, and we can continue it for the podcast audience, but we're going to lose the broadcast audience.
Well, I'm not allowed to override your doctor's opinion. So if your doctor says you should do it, then I can't tell you that you shouldn't. I have the personal opinion, not professional opinion, but personal opinion, that if you would come to us first, that we might be able to save you that surgery. That's my personal opinion, and I think that I've discovered that it's better to cultivate a sense of confidence rather than cultivate a sense of fear. So rather than giving yourself the message that you can't control yourself by, the only way you can control it is with some external force preventing you, then I discovered that tends to make things worse, as opposed to recognizing that you can take control and delineate how you're supposed to eat and move forward in that way. So that's what I think about it personally. Legally, do what your doctor says.
Okay, quick. Tell me how people can get in touch with you for the broadcast audience.
NeverBingeAgain.com. Click the big red button. You'll get a free copy of the book in Kindle, Nook, or PDF format, a set of food plan starter templates for any dietary philosophy, and a set of recorded coaching sessions so that this weird psychologist who has a pig inside of him doesn't seem so weird, and you can see how this actually works.
All right. I really thank you. My broadcast audience, thank you. For those who want to listen to our interview, turn to Yak About Today, and you can listen to the full interview. And welcome back to the Yak About Today podcast. For those of you who came from the broadcast audience, thank you for coming online to listen to us. And for the rest of you who are listening online, we are just continuing. I've got Dr. Glenn Livingston here with me, and we are talking about binge eating. I do have I have one question. It's such a singular subject, binge eating. It seems like is that singularly, you think, the cause of obesity? Is the binge eating? Are there other causes, or is that the main cause? It seems probably it is. I mean, if somebody's getting very, very heavy,
that puts all the responsibility on the person who's doing the binge eating, and the corporations are pressing our evolutionary buttons. They're concentrating salt and sugar and starch and oil and excitotoxins to hit our bliss points without giving us enough nutrition to feel satisfied. And then they're putting an awful lot of money, billions of dollars, into advertising to make us believe we can't live without it. And if you think advertising doesn't affect you, what you should know is that it affects you more when you think it doesn't affect you, because your sales resistance is down. And then the addiction treatment industry says that you can't quit, you can only abstain one day at a time, and that these are irresistible impulses. So there's kind of a perfect storm in our society that sets us up for binge eating. That having been said, you aren't powerless. You can opt out of this matrix and set yourself up for success by clearly delineating what success looks like for you and doing a lot of things that we've talked about so far. But I don't blame the clients in and of themselves. I just think that it's a big mess in this world.
I have a question. When you write about willpower and character, what is the difference between having willpower and, I guess, character means who you are as a person? David, it's interesting. If I ask people, could they give up chocolate, they'll say, oh, never, I could do that. But if I ask them, hey, do you think you could become the kind of person who doesn't eat chocolate? I get a different response. Oh, okay.
And in our society, we're taught to use guidelines as opposed to rules. Hey, why don't you just not have chocolate 90% of the time and have it 10% of the time instead? And on its surface, that's a good North Star. That's a good guiding principle. But the problem with it is that research shows that every time we have to make a decision, we're depleting our willpower. Willpower isn't like an on and off switch. It's more like gas in the tank. And so if you're going to have chocolate 10% of the time, every time you're in Starbucks in front of a chocolate bar, you have to ask yourself, is this part of the 10% or part of the 90%? And you're going to burn some brain glucose in making that decision, and you're going to become weaker and weaker and weaker. And that's why people break down at the end of the day. That's why they just can't make any more good food decisions, and they're ready to, chow down or whatever they want to. So turns out that what's better is to create more of a crystal clear rule. So if you want to have chocolate 90% of the time, you'll say, I will never have chocolate less than 10 days apart. And so you write down the last time you had chocolate, and when 10 days have passed, you can have it again. And then you don't have to make any decisions. and you're just the kind of person who eats chocolate every 10 days or less, or more, however you want to phrase it. And turns out that that's a lot easier to maintain. Now, what you're really doing when you're doing that is building character. And I can illustrate it like this. There are some situations where you have developed rules for yourself to abstain from pleasure in the face of temptation, no matter what, because it's a matter of character to you. For example, if you walk into a diner and there's a $10 bill on the table because the waitress hasn't seen her tip yet, and she says, "I'll be right back, I just have to get you some menus." And there are no people up front, and there's no video camera, and there are no windows. The question is, do you take that $10 bill? No one would see you take it. But 99% of the people I talk to say they would never do that. And I'll say, why? It would be pleasurable. You would be better off. No one would know. And they say, well, I'm not a thief. And I say, so as a matter of character, you're abstaining from that pleasurable activity because of the kind of person that you want to be. And they'll say, yes. And I'll say, well, why can't you do that with food? That's what I'm advocating. Character trumps willpower. I'm just the kind of person who doesn't eat chocolate during the week is much easier to comply with than, oh my God, I'm not going to eat chocolate during the week.
Okay, so I have a question that keeps coming to my mind, and it's a correlation between what you're saying and the process that AA goes through, with alcohol. You have a process that allows people to be more disciplined in a way when they'll eat chocolate or whatever their food of choice is that they binge on, as opposed to an AA process that is supporting the fact that you never do that because once you drink you really can't control it. Do you see where I'm going here?
Yeah, David, the similarity between what I do and what AA might do is that for a lot of people, I actually never have chocolate. I'm someone that never is easier than sometimes. My rule is I'll never eat chocolate again. The difference between the way that I do it and the way that AA does it is that AA says, if you're addicted to chocolate, then you have to make yourself into a dependent child, and you need a sponsor, and you have to go to meetings 3 times a week, and because you're abnormal and you've got some kind of a disease. I don't think I have a disease. I think I have a healthy appetite that was corrupted by industry. I don't think that I need to go to meetings every day. I think that I need to get clarity and focus about what I want to do. I need to get clarity and focus about how I'm constantly talking myself out of that. And I need to get clarity and focus on what my motivation is to go through this process. And then it's like learning how to drive. It's a bunch of work in the beginning to memorize the rules of the road and practice. But once you've done that, you just go on with your life. You don't have to go to a meeting 3 times a week to make sure you know how to drive. You just learn how to drive and keep driving. And most of what I say is antithetical to what the 12-step programs will say.
So when somebody comes to you for therapy as a binge eater, is there sort of... I don't know how to describe it. It's sort of like, 12 sessions, and each of those sessions will go through the process of controlling your binge eating, and then at the end of these sessions, it ends, it's
a short-term process. Yeah,
it is. So, and then if people do have difficulty sticking with it, then they would come back and they would talk through why they're having difficulty. Is that?
Yeah, there are people that make a conscious decision to go back. We call it conscious pig parties, and they go back on their plan. And if they're not able to get themselves upright and on the right track again, then we have little refresher sessions. And what the result of the coaching that we do, most notably, is the restoration of a sense of power and responsibility. People no longer feel like they're out of control. Sometimes, I'm not going to take away your free will. I won't take responsibility for your success, and I won't take responsibility for your failure either. What I'm really good at is showing you how your judgment has been blurred and obfuscated by a lot of mythology and misinformation in the culture. I'm really good at helping you figure out where your personal bullseye is. I'm really good at helping you hear all of those voices of justification and learning how to disempower them. And then people do with that what they will. They do with it what they will. Usually what happens is they get a lot better, then they'll have a couple of conscious pig parties and decide to go off for a while. And then they'll start to say, this is silly because nobody's telling me what to eat. I could change my plan anytime I want to. And why don't I just eat the way that I say I'm going to eat, and I'll feel much better about myself, and I'll accomplish my health and fitness goals. And so there's kind of a natural evolution to a healthy way of eating that people go through. But I don't control that. I don't control their ability to go off if they want to. Right? It's just not like a gastric bypass where I'm forcing you to do something. I'm giving you a power that you didn't have before, and then you decide what you want to do with that power.
Okay, I've got one last question. I think it's part question, part statement.
Yeah.
You talk about reprogramming yourself to think permanently like a thin person.
Yeah.
I don't think we have time to go through the whole thing. I think the statement part is, in our days, it is possible to be on the heavy side and still be healthy. Right? I mean, I think that's what I read about now. That thin.
Yes and no, but yeah.
So is the programming to think like a thin person the right way of looking at it, as opposed to, reprogramming yourself to eat healthy type of thing? Do you see where I'm going?
That's an interesting idea. I mean, I do think there's science and statistics that suggest that it's medically healthier to be thin. I think that that's confused with there's a real stigma that heavy people go through in our society. I don't want to contribute to that in any way. I'm very much against fat shaming. I think people need to be accepted for where they are and helped along the way. But I don't want to distort the definition of like medical health so much that we start to think that it's actually okay to be obese, because I don't think it is.
All right, we're going to wrap it up there. I really want to thank you. I found this really fascinating. It's interesting when we talk about it. I keep thinking, all of a sudden I'm starting to eat a lot of desserts at the end of my meal at night, type of thing, which I never did earlier. And so it makes me think through why all of a sudden, I've gotten into this dessert thing.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm lucky enough right now that I've been going to the gym for, 35 years. So I haven't really gained the weight that I would if I was more sedentary.
Of course.
But anyway, I really love this conversation. I really appreciate it. I hope you'll come back on again. And
David, if you want me to come back on and coach you through your desserts, I'll be happy to do that.
All right. I really appreciate it. Okay. And to the audience listening, thanks so much. I'm David Yakir. You're listening to Yak About Today. I love you. Peace.
Take out the papers and the trash, or you don't get no spending cash. If you don't scrub that kitchen floor, you ain't gonna rock and roll no more. Yakety yak. Don't talk back. Just finish cleaning up your room. Let's see that dust fly with that broom. Get all that garbage out of sight, or you don't go out Friday night. Yakety yak. Don't talk back. Don't you give me no dirty looks. Your father simply knows the cooks. Tell all your hula friends outside, you ain't got time to take a ride. Yakety yak. Don't talk back.